Donald Trump reflects on his presidency, his plan: high tariffs to build wealth, maximize energy production, liquid gold. He still questions the 2020 election and promises to end wars through personal deals with world leaders. He's appointed his team and partnered with RFK Jr. on health. Trump's vision: America first always.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something really unique. We're on a mission to do a direct, completely unfiltered analysis of, well, the highest levels of American power.
And our source material for this is just extraordinary. It's not a book, it's not a speech, it's this sprawling transcript of a very extensive conversation with a former president.
Yeah, and it covers everything. I mean, from the psychological shock of just stepping into the office all the way down to, the granular mechanics of global policy.
It's a rare treasure for a deep dive like this. What we have here, it's not the polished sound bites you'd hear at a rally. It's personal, it's often raw, and it's a reflection on what it's like to govern.
Especially from the outside.
Exactly. This is a crucial vantage point because this president came from completely outside the political ecosystem. So he's describing the transition, the internal resistance he felt, the policy choices, things like tariffs, environmental regulations, all through this very distinct, non-traditional lens.
So our goal for you, the learner, is really to bypass all the noise and just extract the pure actionable insights from this. We're going to focus on the surprising structural challenges of the White House machinery, the deep-seated cultural conflicts he ran into, and the mechanisms behind some of his most, let's say, controversial policy decisions.
Right. This is your shortcut. It's a comprehensive, focused look at the genuine insider experience of an outsider presidency.
Okay, so let's unpack this journey. And I think we have to start where it all began, that pivot from being a celebrity to a candidate. When you really look at the source material, the journey from being this, ubiquitous New York business icon to a political candidate, it wasn't a slow drift. It was a sudden, almost binary shift.
A total flip
Yeah.
in public and media perception. Before he became what they saw as a viable political threat, he recounts this environment of, overwhelming favorability.
Especially from the exact same media circles that later became his biggest antagonists.
The contrast he describes it's almost hard to wrap your head around. He vividly recalls appearing on shows like The View around, 2015 or 2016?
And he says he was introduced not as a political figure, but as
our friend Donald Trump. He mentions getting genuine warmth hugs and kisses from people like Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, Barbara Walters.
Wow.
And the consensus back then, which he points out, was that he was, fiscally conservative, but very liberal socially. He fit that certain New York archetype the media was comfortable with.
That's a really crucial detail. That specific social positioning let him move in circles that, a traditional conservative politician just couldn't access.
Right. And he also mentioned his appearance on Oprah Winfrey's final show. He characterized that whole pre-political life as a very wonderful life, totally separate from the brutal political world.
So what was the catalyst for the change? The insight here is, when did it flip?
He claims it flipped instantaneously and violently, not because of a new policy or some big scandal, but the moment his poll numbers showed that he was actually winning.
So viability.
That shift from friendly coverage to what he calls coordinated, systematic attacks was, in his view, unprecedented. He says there's probably no one in history who's seen such a rapid, systematic reversal of media fortune. He literally describes it as living two different lives.
And that distinction, that viability, is what triggers the opposition.
Yeah.
That's so central to understanding the outsider experience, right? An established politician, they get vetted for decades. It's slow, it's incremental. But for a celebrity who crosses that line into serious political power, the system, whether it's the bureaucracy or the media, it seems to recognize the threat immediately and just responds with a full court press.
It speaks volumes about the established political order. His memory of those friendly celebrity days compared to the reality now, it really underscored this powerful realization for him. The system only gives you access and favorability as long as you're just entertaining.
And non-threatening.
The moment you become a structural threat, everything changes. He realized how much public perception had been swayed and how quickly the rules shifted since, the days Oprah was encouraging him to even consider politics.
Okay, but to make that jump, he had to walk away from one of the greatest successes of his life, The Apprentice. And we really can't overstate the scale of what he sacrificed there.
Oh, absolutely. He emphasized the show was still hugely popular. Doing great, he said. It had a long, successful run. 12 years, 14 scenes, and that included 2 double seasons.
And the transcript reveals that NBC executives, people like Paul Telegi, were actively trying to talk him out of running.
They were offering extensions, incentives, everything.
And what was the classic line they used? He remembers it specifically.
Nobody gives up primetime.
Right.
From a purely business perspective, it was completely irrational. Giving up a top-rated primetime network show to run as a non-politician against, 18 professional people?
Mostly career politicians.
Right. They saw it as a guaranteed failure and a huge financial blunder. They just wanted to extend his contract. They thought his political ambition was crazy for risking such a huge established success.
So if the business incentive was obviously to stay, what was the initial spark that actually convinced him to do it, to run?
The motivation, he says, goes back a few years earlier. He recounted the specific poll that was done maybe 3 or 4 years before his official run.
Okay.
And this poll, sort of unexpectedly, included his name alongside Mitt Romney. And according to the source, he showed this surprising, overwhelming strength. He said he blew everybody away.
So that was the moment.
That was the moment he shifted from, casually thinking about it to giving it real thought.
And timing, he stressed, was absolutely critical, not just politically, but for his personal life and his business.
He needed to make sure his whole business empire was settled. He waited until all his major building projects were totally completed and finalized. And crucially, he waited until his kids were mature enough and integrated enough into the business to manage it on their own.
So this wasn't a whim.
Not at all. He waited for the cycle after what he called the Romney disaster, which suggests a very calculated timing. It was driven by both personal readiness and what he saw as a vacuum in Republican leadership. It was a decision predicated on finishing his prior life's work first.
Leaving the chaos of a campaign trail and then stepping into the literal seat of presidential power. I mean, it must feel like being launched into orbit.
The source uses the word surreal over and over again to describe Inauguration Day and that initial entry into the White House.
He gave a really powerful anchor point for that feeling, too. He contracted it with a previous traumatic personal experience, specifically being involved in a shooting.
Right.
And he said even in that moment, which was physically traumatic, it wasn't surreal. He said in that emergency, he knew exactly what was going on.
But the presidency was different.
The presidency was this overwhelming sensory experience, just an out-of-body feeling that was hard to ground in reality.
The motorcade down Pennsylvania Avenue, that's the iconic image of the transfer of power. How did he describe that moment? He noted the sheer scale of the security.
Wow.
Just motorcycles, police, military personnel, all forming this impenetrable shield. A major thing, he called it. He even found the simple fact of driving down Pennsylvania Avenue in the opposite direction of normal traffic to be symbolically weird. But despite all that security, the public reaction, the massive crowds, it generated such a strong energy that he described feeling the love was so crazy.
And that energy actually made him break from protocol
It
again.
did. He said, driven by that moment, he and Melania, and he noted she was wearing her beautiful dress, they briefly got out of the car for a short walk to wave.
And he framed that spontaneous decision not as a risk, but as something else.
As a staple. He called it very important, a connection with the public that he felt he just had to honor in that moment.
So once he finally crosses the threshold and is inside the White House, he actually pauses to appreciate the physical space, which is something you rarely hear discussed.
Yeah, and given his career building luxury structures, he explicitly says he made money on luxury, he was highly attuned to the architectural details. He noted that most people, they're so focused on the politics, they rarely talk about the White House's interior beauty.
What do you say people expect?
He said they expect metal doors and stuff, or just a purely bureaucratic look, but he found it gorgeous. He detailed the impressive scale. He said the hallway was 25 feet wide, beautiful ceiling heights. He was really appreciating the craftsmanship that defined the residence.
Now this leads us to the Lincoln bedroom anecdote, which is a really key emotional and historical moment in the source material.
Yeah.
Why was this the first place he asked to see? And what did he find there?
It's a fascinating detail, especially for a non-politician. Despite never having held office, the historical weight of Abraham Lincoln clearly resonated with him. He immediately asked to see the Lincoln bedroom.
And what stood out to him?
The physical history. The elongated bed, which was necessary because Lincoln was 6'6", and he compared that to his son, Barron, who's 6'9".
But it wasn't just the physical objects. It was the deeper emotional history that he said made the room so powerful.
Absolutely. Beyond seeing the original Gettysburg Address in the room, he really focused on Lincoln's personal pain. He referenced the devastating reality that both Lincoln and his wife suffered from melancholia, which we'd now call severe depression. And it was made worse by the trauma of the Civil War and losing their son, Tad.
Oh.
He mentioned seeing a little tiny picture of Tad in the room, and that's what made the whole hallowed space feel beautiful and surreal. He also acknowledged the overwhelming psychological pressure Lincoln was under fighting not just political opponents, but a military genius like Robert E. Lee during a brutal war. The experience connected him to the sheer human cost of holding that office.
That initial reverence, though, for the historical office, it seems like that was pretty short-lived once the day-to-day reality of the job set in.
It faded fast. He said the feeling of the White House being a hallowed place eventually wore off, and it just became the place he lived and worked. The source explains that the central challenge was this perpetual state of conflict.
What was the conflict?
Simultaneously trying to focus on governing the country and just survival. He emphasized that the challenges, specifically impeachment attempts, started almost immediately after he won the election, even before he was formally in office.
So he's saying the institutional opposition was baked in from day one.
Yes, forcing him to fight for survival rather than just focusing on executing his policies.
So if the job became about survival, that suggests that picking his personnel, the people around him, that became the most critical and maybe the most difficult part of the job.
You've just hit on the key structural conflict for any outsider. The scale of the task is just staggering. The source material specifies that the president is involved in something like 10,000 appointments.
10,000?
And while, Treasury, State, the military secretaries are the high-profile ones, those people then go on to appoint hundreds more throughout their agencies and departments.
Therefore, someone with basically no personal history or network in Washington, D.C., that is an immediate, almost catastrophic logistical problem.
Precisely. He noted the stark fact that he'd only visited Washington 17 times before his run and had never once stayed overnight. He just candidly admitted, I didn't know anybody.
So he had to rely on recommendations.
Completely. This forced him into a system where he had to rely on recommendations, often from former primary opponents he got to like during the campaign, or people that his campaign staff vouched for.
And this dependency on outside recommendations, that leads to what he termed the danger of non-vetted picks. What exactly is the systemic difference he's pointing out between vetting a politician and a business person?
Well, historically, the vast majority of presidents, 92%, were politicians. The other 8% were generals, like Washington or Eisenhower. He was the first non-elected business person.
Yep.
A politician has been running for office or in Congress or a governor for years. Their personal and financial lives have been intensely vetted by opponents, media, campaigns over many cycles. A CEO of a big company, though, their personal baggage or eccentricities are often hidden behind NDAs and corporate privacy.
So picking one for a top government role is a huge risk.
He argues it's dangerous because the moment they enter that political vetting pipeline, embarrassing or even compromising personal details can get exposed, and that creates a high degree of risk and instability in the administration.
It sounds like the political machine itself is a pre-vetting mechanism. If you haven't survived that gauntlet already, you're just an unpredictable risk. And this leads directly to his fascinating analysis of Washington culture, the difference between stiffs and survivors.
He defines stiffs as the established people who are just utterly indoctrinated into the system.
Yeah.
They are, by definition, survivors, people who prioritize their career longevity over any kind of radical change.
Which means they avoid controversy.
They intentionally avoid controversy, they never take chances, and they only move at the pace of the bureaucracy.
And he used a specific anecdote about a congressman to perfectly illustrate that survival mentality over action.
He did. He recounted working with a 28-year congressman on an issue that involved a controversial but, he said, objectively easy license renewal. The congressman refused to help.
Why?
Because it might draw political fire. And the source saw this as the epitome of the survivor mentality. The congressman was smart, he knew the system, but his main motivation was just ensuring he could stay in office for another 3 decades, not actually helping solve problems quickly.
So the takeaway for the learner here is profound. In Washington, success is often measured by how long you can survive without making a mistake, not by how much you accomplish.
Exactly. That mentality suggests Washington is a place of inertia, not action. But despite all the negative press suggesting his administration was toxic and that nobody wanted to work there, the source claims the demand for these positions was intense.
He was really emphatic about this.
Very. He said everyone, from career staff to high-flying business people, begs for these positions. They die for it. He described this hypothetical, rich, successful person who desperately wants to be Secretary of State, but would publicly claim, "No, I don't think I would do it," if asked by the media.
While secretly
Begging for it through back channels. He argued the whole public narrative that people refused to work for him was just a deliberate distortion.
Okay, so given the successes he cited, rebuilding the military, the tax cuts, the economy, 3 Supreme Court justices, what did he identify as his single biggest mistake?
It all boils down to personnel. He regretted picking people he shouldn't have, specifically citing neocons or bad people or disloyal people, often based on bad advice he got.
Let's just pause there for a moment and define neocon in this specific context for our listener.
Right. In political speak, particularly when you're talking about White House appointments, neocon, short for neoconservative, usually refers to foreign policy hawks. These are people who advocate for a really interventionist foreign policy, often involving military force and regime change.
They see America's role as policing the globe.
And actively promoting democracy through force if needed. That perspective often clashes with an America first or non-interventionist stance. So the source's regret was picking these people who were structurally inclined toward global conflict or system maintenance rather than his own disruptive strategy.
And the specific examples he cited of appointees.
He used particularly strong language. John Kelly was described as a bully, but ultimately a weak person. John Bolton was called an idiot and a nut job.
But he did offer a sort of complex backhanded compliment to Bolton.
He did, which was interesting. He argued that Bolton was ironically useful because his extreme reputation made foreign adversaries worry that the administration was erratic and might go to war immediately if provoked. A strange form of deterrence, I guess.
And the Ruffin anecdote relates directly to this danger of ignoring good advice when making these high-stakes picks.
Absolutely. He recounted being warned specifically about Bolton by Phil Ruffin, a very smart, wealthy associate from Las Vegas, who told him flat out, "Don't hire that guy." He hired him anyway and said he regretted ignoring that specific warning. It just reinforces how difficult it is for an outsider to discern loyalty and competence from inside a hostile political environment. This whole section really underscores the idea that for an outsider, finding true loyalty and competence is often their biggest vulnerability.
It's fascinating that someone who had to navigate that whole maze of appointments, which is the ultimate insider game, then thrived through the exact opposite.
Yeah.
A communication style that was utterly authentic and outward-facing. The conversation then pivots sharply into the strategy that vaulted him past all those Washington stiffs and survivors.
Yeah, and he credits his rise, especially during the primaries, to the media's unintentional role. He argued that networks like CNN were constantly highlighting his wild shit, as he put it. They thought they were damaging him.
But they were actually helping him.
They were boosting his appeal. His core belief is that the public was just completely exhausted by the bullshit, pre-prepared politician lingo and craved genuine, unrehearsed authenticity, even if they disagreed with the content.
And that need for authenticity often manifested as this sharp humor and comedic timing, which is just unheard of for a modern presidential candidate.
Exactly. He referenced the political utility of his impressions from a Biden impression to an Elon Musk one, and his sharp, unrehearsed delivery, like the famous line directed at Hillary Clinton that she would be in jail.
Right.
The conclusion he drew about the political landscape today is telling. The arena is now so antagonistic, so mediated, that you almost need the attitude of a comedian just to navigate the constant system of attack and counterattack. He called the presidency the most dangerous business outside of war itself.
And he didn't stop at a metaphor for danger. He used actual statistics to make a pretty jarring point about the risk of holding the office.
He did. He looked at professions like race car driving and bull riding, where statistically about 0.1% of people in them die. He asserted that the presidency has a higher statistical danger, especially when the person in office is making consequential decisions that upset powerful global interests.
Yeah, and he gives me specific examples of policies that he thinks drove that risk.
He did, taking in hundreds of billions of dollars from China through tariffs and stopping Iran from selling its oil. He argues that second one effectively bankrupted them and, in turn, defunded proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas. He states that these necessary actions inherently make him a target, but he still does what's right.
This all leads to his overarching critique of the current media landscape, which he argues is just institutionally crooked.
He was very clear that he believes the mainstream press is institutionally crooked and by engaging in distortion is killing its own credibility. But ironically, he sees this collapse of trust in established media as opening up a massive, unprecedented opportunity for independent and new media platforms to thrive.
And he provided a very specific and highly controversial example he labeled as fraud regarding 60 Minutes and Kamala Harris. We have to relay this assertion impartially.
Right. The source claims that CBS's 60 Minutes engaged in deceptive editing of a response given by Kamala Harris. He alleges that her original answer was so inadequate, showing her, in his words, essentially incompetent, that they removed it entirely and replaced it with a different, marginally better but still poor answer.
And he insisted this was beyond normal editing.
Way beyond. He called it deliberate fraud, and the biggest scandal in broadcast history, emphasizing that this manipulation occurred on a flagship news program, not some entertainment show.
This accusation of deliberate manipulation ties right into his concept of the weave and how context is stripped away to distort narratives.
The weave is his term for his communication style, weaving together stories, ideas, and concepts, often using humor or hyperbole to make a point. He argued that opponents intentionally stripped the context from these narratives to create a false, often inflammatory story.
And he cited two big examples of this distortion.
He did. First, his comments about Robert E. Lee being intentionally taken out of context to imply sympathy for the Confederacy. Second, the famous bloodbath quote, which he clarified referred specifically to the potential decimation of the American auto industry if China or Japan were allowed to continue exporting cars without penalty.
Not literal violence.
Not literal violence. So for him, the point of the weave is that the context always comes back home for his intended audience, but the process of stripping that context allows propagandists to mislead everyone else. It's an assertion that his communication style, while unconventional, is inherently honest to his base, but that the entrenched media system actively works to break the weave to create a politically damaging narrative, intentionally sending the uninitiated into the wilderness of confusion and distortion.
Let's shift into specific policy mechanics, starting with what he sees as his most powerful economic lever: tariffs. He infamously called tariffs the most beautiful word.
He truly did. He elevated tariffs above almost everything else, describing them as more beautiful than love and any other word in the dictionary. And the proposed strategy is revolutionary in a modern context.
Which is?
To eliminate income taxes entirely and replace all the lost revenue with funds generated by tariffs on imported goods.
That's a radical shift in how the government would fund itself.
Yeah.
Did he cite any historical model for a zero income tax, tariff-funded nation?
He did. He cited President William McKinley, who he called the Tariff King, who governed in the late 1880s and early 1900s. The source argued that McKinley's policies of robustly taxing foreign imports to protect American industries made the country so wealthy that they ran into an extraordinary problem.
Surplus.
A massive money surplus. In 1887, they literally had to create a commission just to figure out what to do with all the extra money generated by taxing foreign goods that were competing with American labor. So that's the historical precedent he uses to justify a complete shift away from income tax.
The theory, then, is that by heavily taxing foreign goods, you simultaneously protect domestic jobs and fund the government without taxing the labor of American workers.
Exactly. It's an argument for shifting the tax burden away from domestic labor and production and onto foreign producers and consumers of imported goods. And he also cited a very recent application of this policy that he says showed instant real-world impact.
This was with China and Mexico.
Right. He threatened massive tariffs ranging from 100% to 200% on cars that China planned to build in Mexico and then sell in the U.S., arguing those cars would become unsaleable. The immediate result, he claims, was that China canceled the world's largest planned auto plant in Mexico. He saw this as a clear victory, doing a big favor for our country, achieved purely through strategic rhetoric and the threat of economic policy.
Shifting to domestic tax policy, he defended his decision to lower corporate taxes from nearly 40% down to 21%, with a proposal to cut it even further to 15% for products made here.
And he challenged the whole notion that tax cuts automatically lead to less revenue. He argued that the U.S. collected more revenue in the first year at that 21% rate than it did at the previous higher rate.
And he attributes this to two core mechanisms.
Two things. First, the tax cuts inspired massive economic growth and business expansion, which increased the overall tax base. And second, the cuts included incentives for repatriation of money. Companies like Apple, for instance, brought hundreds of billions of dollars back from overseas accounts, money that was previously just sitting abroad because the hurdles and tax rates were too high.
But the reality is the deficit still went up substantially during his term. How did he explain that divergence?
He laid the responsibility for that squarely on the COVID-19 pandemic. He argued that without the necessity of that massive spending required to shore up businesses, provide relief, and prevent what he called a 1929-style depression, the debt would have been reduced rapidly because of the robust economic growth.
And he also emphasized regulation cuts as a key driver.
A key, often overlooked driver. He mentioned that many big company CEOs told him that the reduction in crippling federal regulations was even more important to their investment decisions than the tax cuts themselves were.
Okay, let's follow that thread on regulation, specifically environmental concerns. He viewed environmentalism not just as a policy area, but as a systemic tool used to stop economic development.
He was unequivocal. He stated that environmental concerns, second only to regulation in general, are the biggest tool used to halt growth. And he then described the self-perpetuating system built around that obstruction, what he calls the consultant system.
How does this consultant and lawyer system profit from regulatory capture? This is a crucial detail for you, the learner.
So the source alleges that these environmental consultants and lawyers intentionally drag out processes, often for 10 or 15 years, collecting huge fees the entire time. And they do this by convincing regulators to enforce what he calls absurd, hyper-specific standards.
Like what?
For example, labeling common native plants as rare, or designating a tiny temporary puddle as a protected lake that requires full lake-level environmental protections. These tactics, he argued, are used as economic weapons to stop construction and industrial projects cold, all while benefiting the consultants who extend the process forever.
He gave an astonishing example of this bureaucratic paralysis in Louisiana concerning an LNG facility.
Yes, the Louisiana LNG plant. For our listeners, LNG is liquefied natural gas, and it's vital for global energy export. This was an $18 billion project that he claimed was stalled for 14 years. The reason? An error on one line of paperwork. One line in paperwork that filled an entire room. And it prevented the permit from being granted. He stated that the moment the error was flagged to him, he granted the permit instantly, which crystallizes his point about the difference between bureaucratic inertia and executive action.
Turning to specific energy and water policies, he focused heavily on the situation in California, where you have all this fertile land just left barren.
He visited this farmland and described it as brown and desolate. And he said the tragedy is that this wasn't due to a lack of water, but due to policy. He stated that water is intentionally rerouted into the Pacific Ocean to protect a tiny little fish.
The delta smelt.
The delta smelt, yeah, which is often at the center of these water policy battles. He highlighted the historical absurdity of this, pointing out that Tachi Lake, which was once one of the largest freshwater lakes west of the Mississippi, existed in that region and was drained centuries ago. So it proves the land can sustain vast water resources. He argues the policy choice protecting the fish over agricultural productivity is simply misguided.
And what about major resource finds, specifically the ANWR project in Alaska?
ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, is claimed to hold oil and gas reserves equivalent to Saudi Arabia's. The source claimed he managed to get the ANWR project approved, something even President Reagan couldn't do, but that the next administration halted it for purely political reasons, not legitimate environmental danger. He asserted the drilling could have been done responsibly, stressing the national security and economic importance of leveraging such massive domestic energy resources.
He also launched a pretty significant critique against wind power, calling it dystopian.
The criticism was multifaceted and very strong. He argued windmills are the most expensive source of electricity and are environmentally disruptive. He cited the massive bird deaths, creating bird cemeteries, he called them, and the damage caused by the vibration of these enormous offshore windmills.
He linked them to an increase in whale strandings.
Yeah, in New Jersey, claiming there were 18 in the last year compared to 1 in the previous 50 years, stating the vibration drives the whales freaking crazy. And on top of that, he described the visual and environmental damage of abandoned wind farms, citing examples in California where rusted, non-functional windmills create this ugly, dystopian graveyard.
So if tariffs replace income tax and oil and gas are maximized, what is the preferred clean energy solution?
Nuclear power. He promoted it as cleaner and safer. But he strongly criticized the American regulatory process around nuclear development. He argued that U.S. plants are designed to be too big, too complex, which makes them vulnerable to regulatory delay.
And he shared a shocking example of this.
He did. Regulatory paranoia, he called it. Inspectors demanded the ripping down of $25 billion worth of hardened concrete containment walls because of a 1/4-inch deviation from the complex blueprint. It just shows how hyper-regulation can derail essential projects.
And he contrasted that with the French model.
He praised the French model, which uses smaller, more compact, and connected nuclear plants, making them easier to deploy and manage. He concluded this section with a nod to his uncle, Dr. John Trump, an MIT professor, who he said foresaw nuclear power as the energy future while simultaneously warning about its dangers in military use.
Moving from domestic energy to global strategy, the source addressed what he perceives as the world's most critical threats.
Right, and he defined the ultimate existential threat not as global warming, but as nuclear warming. Regarding North Korea, he claimed that the Obama administration had basically resigned itself to the expectation of war.
But he argued his personal diplomacy changed that.
Even the initial insults like "little rocket man," he said, were calculated moves that ultimately led to Kim Jong-un requesting a meeting. The tangible result, he claimed, was 18 months without a single soldier conflict on the peninsula, which he credited to his direct personal engagement.
And concerning the greatest ongoing conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war, he asserted it would have been entirely averted under his presidency.
He gave two main reasons for that confidence. First, he claimed a high level of personal respect from Vladimir Putin, stating that he told Putin directly, "You're not going in," establishing a firm boundary.
And the second reason was economic.
Second, he argued that low global oil prices, which were around $40 a barrel during his term, would have prevented Russia from funding such a long conflict. Low energy revenue would starve their war machine. And he promised that if he's elected, he would use those past relationships and leverage to stop the war quickly as president-elect.
Okay, now let's turn to the subject that generated near-universal condemnation from across the political spectrum: the Afghanistan withdrawal. The source highlighted two major strategic mistakes that he claims ruined the execution.
He claimed that the consensus among the real generals on the ground, not the television generals who serve as pundits, was that the withdrawal was catastrophically mishandled. The first major error was the sequence of departure.
Taking the soldiers out first.
Taking the soldiers out first, before the equipment and the citizens. He asserted that a child would know that military personnel have to be the last to leave to secure the process.
And the second mistake involved the literal assets left behind.
Yeah, the staggering amount of sophisticated equipment. He stated that billions of dollars of the world's best military hardware tanks, Black Hawk helicopters, advanced night vision goggles, were intentionally at London based on what he called the poor advice of General Milley, who allegedly suggested it was cheaper to leave it.
Which was a massive financial mistake and a national embarrassment.
But the profound national embarrassment, he argued. The Taliban immediately used this equipment in parades, humiliating the U.S. on the global stage.
And the abandonment of Bagram Airfield was another critical strategic error he pointed out.
Bagram was essential due to its massive strategic size, but also its location. He argued it should have been the very last location abandoned, primarily because of its proximity. It's only about an hour away from where China manufactures its nuclear missiles. Abandoning that strategic asset, in his view, gave a significant operational and intelligence advantage to a key geopolitical rival.
Finally, the swift defeat of ISIS. He claimed the victory was constrained not by the field commander's ability, but by systemic resistance in Washington.
He asserts that the real generals on the ground defeated 100% of the ISIS caliphate in a matter of weeks, despite being told by Washington figures that the operation would take 5 years. The source's analysis is that the delay wasn't incompetence among the troops, but a systemic failure.
Driven by orders from Washington.
Orders from Washington. He specifically named individuals like Mattis and Milley, who were telling smart field generals what to do. He viewed this as the arrogant fool syndrome, suggesting the existing bad system prevented a swift, decisive victory until those constraints were removed.
This theme of systemic resistance, preventing rapid, effective action, it clearly runs through both domestic regulation and military strategy for him.
We must now address the most polarizing section of the transcript, where the source consistently asserted that the 2020 election was crooked, robbed, and stolen. And we have to be sure we report on these claims impartially, attributing them directly to the source's viewpoint.
Absolutely. The source points to several specific examples of what he alleges was systemic interference that swayed the outcome. What were the mechanisms he highlighted?
The first claim involves the lack of proper legislative approval for voting extensions and changes in key battleground states. He cites Wisconsin as an example where he claims they virtually admitted that the election was rigged by bypassing state legislatures to implement new voting rules.
The second major mechanism, he argued, was a continuous narrative of collusion leading up to the election.
He stressed the impact of the Russia hoax, which provided this constant negative narrative about collusion with Russia for 2.5 years, poisoning public perception.
And even more impactful, in his view,
was the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story. He claimed 51 former intelligence agents lied by labeling the verified laptop contents as Russian disinformation when he says they knew it was real. The source asserted that this suppression alone, keeping critical information from voters, made a 17-point difference in the final result. He claims since he lost by only 22,000 votes, this factor was decisive.
The source also expressed deep suspicion regarding public opinion polling, particularly after what happened in 2016.
He argued that polls were unreliable and potentially fraudulent. He cited a Washington Post ABC poll that had him down 17 points in Wisconsin the day before the 2016 election.
Which he won.
Which he ultimately won. His theory is that these overwhelmingly negative polls are used not just to gauge opinion, but as a deliberate mechanism of fraud to suppress voter turnout. The negative narrative leads potential voters to believe their candidate has no chance, convincing them not to waste my time by going to the polls, especially if there's bad weather.
So what vulnerabilities does he identify, and what solutions are proposed to prevent this alleged interference?
He identified mail-in ballots as the primary vector for fraud, citing the findings of the Jimmy Carter Commission, which advised against the widespread use of mail-in voting. He argues that the COVID-19 pandemic was just used as an excuse to push this method, which he characterized as systemic cheating.
And the argument against opposition to voter ID was deemed the most bizarre argument.
He argues that the opposition to requiring voter ID, a requirement for everyday things like getting a driver's license or entering a federal building, is only maintained by politicians like Chuck Schumer because, he says, they want to cheat. He highlighted the alleged absurdity of a specific Gavin Newsom bill in California that he claimed made it illegal even to ask a person for voter ID, framing it as blatant enablement of fraud.
And the practical solutions he advocated for moving forward.
A return to paper ballots. He argued they would cost only 8% of the complex and vulnerable machine systems we use now. He stressed that these paper ballots could be sophisticated, watermarked for security, and counted quickly, allowing results to be known by 9 p.m. on election night.
And he cited Elon Musk on this.
Crucially, yes. He cited Elon Musk, who allegedly told him that without paper ballots, it can never be an honest election. He also wants additional ID requirements to specifically prove citizenship before voting.
This intense focus on political disruption. It connects with his final cultural observation, the rise of a conservative rebel identity among young people who are rejecting what he calls woke bullshit.
He cited several polarizing policies that he claimed nobody wants, but which are pushed by the political left. Examples like open borders, which he asserted allowed 21 million or more people into the country, including thousands of violent criminals and rapists.
The estimated massive spending on migrants, claiming the cost is $200 billion.
And policies allowing biological males to compete in women's sports. He claimed he has never met a person who actively requests that policy change.
And the resulting cultural shift, he suggests, is a fascinating reversal of traditional political tribes.
He asserted that young people are now rejecting these woke policies, leading to a new cultural dynamic where being a Republican or a conservative is no longer seen as the established position, but rather the rebel or punk rock choice, bucking the pervasive progressive norms you find in academia and corporate culture.
Finally, the source discussed the severe challenge in the justice system being weaponized against political opposition.
He claimed to have been investigated more times than notorious figures like Al Capone, arguing that the investigations are solely a political tactic reserved only for third world countries. He positioned himself as having shown restraint by choosing not to prosecute Hillary Clinton, viewing that action as potentially damaging to the country's unity.
And he used the James Comey anecdote to illustrate how even that protective move was mishandled.
Because Comey, who he called a PR hound, listed all the killer charges against Clinton during a press conference before declaring her innocent. He suggested the desire for airtime overshadowed the national interest.
Moving beyond policy and immediate politics, the conversation did touch on some historical mysteries and health policy. Let's start with the JFK and MLK files.
He confirmed opening the JFK files partially during his term. However, he stated that good people, including figures like Mike Pompeo, asked him to hold back the rest of the documents.
Why?
Because their release could affect living people or current national security interests. He asserted that he would open them immediately if he wins the election. And intriguingly, he also mentioned that there is a Martin Luther King file that people have requested to see.
And the topic that always raises eyebrows, UAPs and UFOs. Was the former president personally convinced by the evidence?
He admitted he was not a believer and that it wasn't a major focus of his personal interest. However, he confirmed interviewing solid people. He specifically mentioned Commander David Fravor and other jet pilots who provided credible testimony.
What did they describe seeing?
Objects moving 4 times faster than an F-22, defying all known human propulsion methods. Things like moving instantly from 50,000 feet to 50 feet in a second. He stressed that these were solid, beautiful people with high credibility, not conspiracy theorists, which forced him to acknowledge the seriousness of the unexplained sightings.
A surprising connection he revealed was his support for RFK Jr., particularly on health policy.
Yeah, he supported RFK Jr.'s focus on health under the umbrella of Make America Healthy Again. He highlighted alarming statistics about the nation's health crisis, low life expectancy despite the highest health expenditure globally, and the claim that 70% of young men are ineligible for military service due to obesity and other health issues. This suggests a shared concern over metabolic health and environmental factors like chemicals and pesticides.
But he drew a very clear line between that support and policy implementation.
Absolutely. He caveated his support by stating he would keep RFK Jr. away from energy policy, which he described as liquid gold, due to their fundamental differences on the future of oil and gas production.
He also targeted a very specific health-related aspect of American consumer culture: pharmaceutical advertising.
He criticized the U.S. and New Zealand for being the only countries that allow direct-to-consumer drug ads on TV. He finds it embarrassing that these ads list horrific potential side effects, like blindness or cancer, yet they continue to increase sales despite the risks. His underlying argument here is that the focus on high-cost medication is an inadequate solution to poor public health, which he believes should be addressed by prioritizing metabolic health, nutrition, and diet.
And finally, just to ground the conversation in the present day, he shared an unexpected, seemingly minor detail about a McDonald's event.
He mentioned a recent high-traffic event he held at a McDonald's, which Google noted was one of the biggest search hits in years. He used this anecdote, which demonstrated his current popularity, to briefly address a recurring claim made by Kamala Harris about having worked at McDonald's. He claimed the manager refuted this, classifying it as another small but persistent public deception in the political sphere.
We have certainly covered an extraordinary amount of ground today. I mean, moving from the psychological impact of the Oval Office to the specific high-stakes mechanics of tariffs, environmental permitting, and foreign military strategy. The value for you, the learner, really lies in these anecdotes. The Lincoln bed, the $25 billion concrete wall that was torn down over a quarter-inch error, the tiny little fish. They aren't just details, they are specific data points that fully illustrate that conflict between a disruptive outside force and a deeply entrenched, risk-averse system.
And what this deep dive truly reveals is the fundamental tension that defined this presidency. The conflict between an outsider's desire for immediate disruptive results, whether that's aggressive tariffs, rapid regulation cuts, or a swift ISIS defeat, and a deeply entrenched institutional structure.
A structure that promotes the survivors and stiffs.
Exactly. That system thrives on inertia, on complexity, and on media gatekeeping. The reality of high office, as described in this transcript, is less about policy brilliance and much more about navigating loyalty traps, systemic bureaucracy, and a systematic opposition that begins before the transfer of power is even complete.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to consider. We spent a lot of time detailing how the Washington Establishment Congress, the bureaucracy, much of the media elevates and protects survivors who avoid controversy and minimize mistakes, which leads to this institutional inertia. If non-politicians are systemically rejected by the traditional vetting process, systematically undermined by the press, and continuously delayed by regulatory paralysis, does the structure of government itself, as it's currently designed, make true fundamental change impossible, regardless of who is elected? What kind of established political and economic system is this structure actually designed to protect?